This will be the seventh and my last lecture on the thought of Karl Marx. I had some things that I wanted to say next week, but since this is the Bafo conclusion of my argument, since I'm going to fulfill my promise to introduce the irony into the equations and weave everything together into a single story today, I thought it would be something of an anticlimax to come back and say, oh, by the way, I have some more to say, like an uncle that you can't get rid of at a Christmas party. So this will be it. You remember that when we started, I described to you the extraordinary experience I had reading Volume 1 of Capital and discovering in it this quite unique mixture of highly inflected literary language, historical materials, economic theory, and philosophical critique of capitalism. And I undertook to find a way to bring this all together. Among the things that I did, as you'll recall, was to teach myself linear algebra and read a whole lot of mathematical economics by very brilliant economists who were re-examining the classical tradition of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and casting it in mathematical form and discovering that a good deal of it had held up, that one could actually give formal proofs of many of the propositions that Ricardo and Marx had enunciated in the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation and in Das Kapital. I talked about the irony and the mystification in those early chapters. I talked about Marx's description of commodity exchange as the inversion of the miracle of transubstantiation in the Catholic Mass. I talked about the historical development of the working class and its historical separation from the means of production and even the skills of production. I talked about the labor theory of value in Ricardo and the way in which Marx took it over. And now I'm going to try to bring that all together. The story began in Marx, you will recall, with a question that he thought his predecessor had not only not answered, but had not even really asked, namely, where does profit come from? In the ideal case described by Ricardo, which Marx was willing to accept for Volume 1 of Capital, commodities exchange at their labor values, which is to say that goods exchange in proportion to the quantities of labor directly and indirectly required for their production. And Marx said, if that's so, how does a capitalist ever make a profit? The capitalist buys his inputs at their price, at a price which is proportional to the labor embodied in them. He combines them in the factory and sells the output, again, at a price proportional to the amount of labor now embodied in those outputs. He gets back everything that he laid out money for and when he gathered together all of his inputs. But how does he ever get rich? It's obvious that he was getting rich. All you had to do was look around London or Liverpool or Manchester and you could see that although the workers were just surviving, the capitalists were getting richer and richer and richer. But it was not clear how they were getting richer, Marx said. And he came up with a solution. You remember the passage that I read you from the very beginning of a chapter called The Buying and Selling of Labor Power. Marx says, we are therefore forced to the conclusion that the change originates in the use value as such of the commodity, i.e. it's in its consumption. And then he writes this very pregnant passage. In order to be able to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags, Geldbesitzer, the possessor of money, must be so lucky as to find within the sphere of circulation in the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption, therefore, is itself an embodiment of labor and consequently a creation of value. The possessor of money does find on the market such a special commodity in capacity for labor or labor power. And it was in the distinction between labor power and labor that Marx found his answer to the question, where does profit come from? Quite simply, the capitalist hires the worker, buys his labor power or her labor power at a fair price, at the price that it would take to reproduce that labor power, the food, clothing, and shelter that the worker needs to work, to live for another day and to come in and work in the factory for another day. Now Marx says, suppose that somewhere in the system, a total of 6 hours of labor has to be performed somewhere, and gets embodied either in the food or the clothing or the shelter that the worker consumes. Well, in that case, the labor power is worth 6 hours of labor. But the worker doesn't work for 6 hours. The laborer works for 10 hours or 12 hours or 14 hours. And that surplus labor time is the source of profit. And indeed, I told you that if you do a little mathematics, you can prove rigorously that the profit of all the capitalists is exactly equal to the surplus labor value extracted from the workers. And it's on the basis of that mathematical equality, which Marx intuited, even though he was incapable of proving it formally, that he enunciated the fundamental proposition of his entire theory, which is, quite simply, that capitalism rests on the exploitation of the working class. That simple statement captures everything that Marx has to say about the structure of capitalism. Now, when I started reading all of these mathematical texts, I found myself in the midst of a blizzard of linear algebra. Now, I have put up in front of you little boards on which I've given little examples of corn and iron models. But that's not what I encountered when I was reading these texts. These sophisticated economists didn't talk about corn and iron. They talked about input A sub 1, or input A sub 2, or input A sub 3, up to input A sub n. And they didn't talk about the labor value of corn or the labor value of iron. They talked about the labor value of input A sub q. And they manipulated their equations, their matrices and so forth, in order to prove all sorts of fascinating propositions about a general capitalist economy regulated by a universal profit rate in which capitalists get rich. Maybe if I'd known more mathematics, I would have read those books more quickly, but since it was hard for me, I puzzled over them. And as I puzzled over them, staring at the page, staring at the equations, trying to make out all those little squiggles with the Greek letters and the subscripts, I realized something odd. A thought occurred to me, which had never occurred to me when I was reading Marx. I looked at the equations and I said, I can see symbols in there that stand for corn and for iron and for wheat and for wool and for flax and for linen and for looms and for spindles and for all the other inputs into production. And I can see symbols in there that stand for the labor that is combined with them. But I don't see any symbol for labor power. I looked at the equations and where's this? I know the story about labor power. I just read you the crucial passage. And Marx talks about labor power in page after page after page. But when I looked at the equations, I couldn't find labor power. So then I set up little, in order to clarify this myself, I set up little equations like these. Here's the basic labor value equations for system C. And what I've done is I've dropped out the theology books, which was kind of a joke anyway, so that I could get all of this on one page, so I didn't have to keep flipping pages. And I looked, and there's the corn sector. Now, there's nothing in the mathematical economics texts about corn sectors. There's just the A1 sector, the A2 sector, the AQ sector, the AN sector. But there's the corn sector. I see a symbol for an amount of labor, that's the 100. And I see a symbol for the amount of corn, that's the 2. and I see a symbol for the amount of iron, that's the 16, and I see a symbol for the output of the corn, that's the 300. And I also see a symbol for the labor value of corn, that's lambda sub c. Lambda is the Greek letter for L, so lambda is obviously labor. That's the labor value of corn, lambda sub c. And lambda sub I is the labor value of iron. Same thing in the iron industry. I looked at all of those symbols and I couldn't find labor power anywhere. So I thought, well, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Let me look in the price and profit equations, not in the labor value equations. So I wrote down the price equations for system C, and I went through this again. There was a P, that's price, so P sub C is the price of corn. P sub I is the price of iron. W is the price of labor, that's the wage. And then there was a pi, that's the profit rate. Remember, 1 plus pi is the markup. And the output is sold at a price of 300 times the price of a unit of corn. Same thing in the iron industry. I could understand all of these symbols, including the new one, the pi, and these new ones, the P sub I and the P sub C, but I still couldn't find labor power. And I thought to myself, maybe labor power doesn't appear in the equations. That's odd. Labor power is the key to Marx's whole explanation of exploitation and the origin of profit. It's because the labor power costs less than a day's laboring that there's extra labor, surplus labor. There's the necessary labor, which you have to expend in order to get the food, clothing, and shelter for another day for the workers. But then there's surplus labor, and that surplus labor is the source of surplus value. And surplus value is the value form of profit. So profit comes out of that extra labor, that surplus labor. And the distinction between the surplus labor and the necessary labor seems to be based on the concept of labor power and the distinction between labor power and labor. Labor power is the worker's capacity to labor. Labor is what the worker actually does. I understood all of that when I read it in Marx, but I couldn't find it in the equations. And as I puzzled over this, looking at these matrices, matrix is an array of symbols between two lines, and they're very formidable looking if you're like me, mathematically only semi-challenged. And as I puzzled over those matrices and those matrix equations, a thought came to me. A thought so strange that at first I put it away, but it kept coming back. I thought to myself, could we figure out what the corn value is of a unit of iron? Corn value. What a ridiculous notion. There is no such thing as corn value. Adam Smith doesn't talk about corn value. David Ricardo doesn't talk about corn value. Karl Marx doesn't talk about corn value. None of these mathematical economists talked about corn value. They talked about labor value. But I thought, look, how do I know which symbol represents corn and which symbol represents labor? Well, there are only two ways. One is the labeling. It's labeled with a C rather than an L. But that's just an arbitrary convention. I could call it anything I wanted. And in these matrix algebra books, they didn't use C for corn. They just used A sub 1, A sub 2, A sub Q, and so forth. So I thought, well, but there's no distinction between corn power and corn, or between iron power and iron. And then I thought, so what? Labor power doesn't appear in the equations, so it doesn't play a role in the theory. It's part of Marx's story, but it doesn't make it into the mathematics, and therefore it's not part of the theory. So if there isn't any such a thing as corn power, who cares? If there isn't any such a thing as an iron power, it doesn't matter. Or wheat power, or wool power, or flax power, or energy power, or wood power, or whatever. that's just a way of talking that doesn't make it into the mathematics. So I asked myself, could you set up equations? Corn value equations? Well, I said, why not? You know, you can't use the letter lambda. That's for labor. We know that. Lambda is the Greek L. It stands for labor. So what letter am I going to use for corn value? Well, alpha, beta, gamma. I guess maybe gamma is the Greek letter for C. Maybe it isn't, but I figured, I don't know Greek, so I just decided I would use gamma. So I did. I set up some equations. I set up some corn value equations for the corn-iron labor system, just like the labor value equations for the corn-iron labor system. Notice that in the labor value equations for the corn-iron labor system, I've added a labor sector. Now that's a very important fact, which I'm going to come back to in a little while, because it's crucial to what we're thinking about. Remember, the central mystification of capitalism, according to Marx, is that workers are treated in the marketplace as though they are commodity producers, bringing their commodity to market and selling it, their commodity being labor. They're not really commodity producers, they're workers, but they're treated as though they were commodity producers. And in that sunlit marketplace, that marketplace where Bentham and justice and equality rule, the workers are not treated as serfs, they're not treated as slaves, they're treated as free and equal commodity producers, bargaining with other commodity producers to sell their commodity, their labor, and to buy some other person's commodity, food, clothing, and shelter. So you're going to have a sector. You're going to have to treat the workers as though they were commodity producers, and that means there's got to be a line for them, for their sector. Now, there wasn't in any of the equations that I was reading in these mathematics books, because they weren't thinking in this way. But I had started to think in this way, so I said, let's put in a line for the workers. Now, the production of labor is essentially by way of consuming the wage, which is the way in which the worker is able to work for another day. So the wage, which I just arbitrarily decided, you understand, I make this stuff up as I go along. The wage I decided was 2.2 units of corn and 0.1 units of iron yields 1 unit of labor. So 0.2 lambda sub c plus 0.1 lambda sub I equals 1 labor unit. That's the output. Now I tried to set up corn value equations, this weird idea I had. Well, if you're setting up labor equations, labor value equations, the labor inputs are direct inputs, so they are listed at full value, 100 or 90. But if you're setting up corn value equations, it's the corn inputs that are listed at full value, not the labor inputs. The labor inputs are going to be discounted by their corn value, So in the first equation, you have 100 units of labor times gamma sub L. Gamma sub L is the corn value of labor. Then there's 2 units of corn. That's not discounted because it's direct corn. Then you have 16 units of iron times the corn value of iron, and all of that yields 300 units of corn. Okay? Same thing for the iron sector, same thing for the labor sector. Now, right away it occurred to me there's a problem, or a potential problem. The whole explanation for exploitation in Marx's theory depends on the fact that it takes less than a day's labor to produce a day's labor. The food, clothing, and shelter that the worker has to consume to work for another day takes less than a day's labor to produce. Marx supposes it takes 6 hours of labor to produce. He's just putting down a number. He doesn't actually know. But suppose it is 6 hours. Well, if it's 6 hours, then the extra 6 hours that the worker is required to work in the factory is surplus labor. It's not necessary labor that he has to work in order to reproduce his food, clothing, and shelter. It's surplus labor time. And that surplus labor time turns out to add up to the profit made by the capitalist. The whole argument depends on the fact that it takes less than a day's labor somewhere in the system, directly and indirectly, to produce a day's labor. That's why there's surplus labor when the laborer works. So I thought to myself, does it take less than a unit of corn to produce a unit of corn? If it doesn't, then you can't make the parallel. But if it does, if it takes less than a unit of corn to produce a unit of corn, then there's going to be some surplus corn left over, some surplus corn value left over. And it better not turn out mathematically to be a negative number. That would be weird if it takes less than 0 corn to produce a unit of corn. But you never know with mathematics. So I sat down and I tried to prove a little linear algebra proof. And mind you, there's nothing special about corn. I could have chosen iron. I could have chosen any of the inputs that are required directly or indirectly somewhere in the system. And I asked myself the question, under what conditions does it take less than a unit of X to produce a unit of X, where X is any of the inputs into production? Corn, iron, wool, flax, wood, energy, coal, anything. And it turns out there's a very simple answer. So long as there is a physical surplus somewhere in the system, not necessarily a physical surplus of corn. There is no physical surplus of labor in the system. Just enough labor is produced to keep the system going. There isn't extra labor produced. So long as there's a physical surplus of X somewhere in the system, the X value of X will be less than 1 and more than 0. And therefore there will be surplus X. What's more, no matter what X you choose, and if you choose X, you know that it covers everything, because you're not relying on the peculiarities of the particular good that you're talking about. You're just treating the mathematical structure of the equations. So long as there's a physical surplus produced anywhere in the system, every one of the propositions that we proved about Marx's labor theory of value holds for a corn theory of value, or an iron theory of value, or an X theory of value. Every single one of them. So it turns out that when there is an equal amount of direct and indirect X required in each, the same proportion in each line of production, then all the prices will be proportional to the X values, just as they were proportional to the labor values under the same circumstances. And it turns out that the total profit appropriated by the capitalists when they sell the output of their factories will exactly equal the surplus X extracted from the X inputs, whatever those X inputs are. So that if you can say that labor is being exploited, you have to also say that iron is being exploited, that wool is being exploited, that corn is being exploited in the same way. I proved it. Wasn't very hard, turns out. It's fairly simple linear algebra. Now, for me, fairly simple linear algebra was the outer limits of what I was able to do. For anybody who's a serious student of mathematics, linear algebra is something you study in your second or third undergraduate year. Linear algebra is not high-powered mathematics, except that economists who like to queen it around and pretend that they're scientists flaunt their linear algebra as though it shows that they're really high-powered types. But a mathematician looks at what they're doing and says, yeah, sure, it's trivial. Trivial is what mathematicians always say anyway, but not impressive. Well, at this point, as you can imagine, I got very depressed, because I said to myself, schmuck, You've just refuted Marx. You, the big Marxist, you've just refuted Marx. Now what? What are you going to do? Put away all your Marx books and start listening to Paul Samuelson or John Maynard Keynes or I mean, and I thought, but wait a minute. Marx was right. He was right that the workers are exploited. He was right that the workers are living at subsistence and the capitalists are getting richer and richer. He was right that the capitalists weren't getting richer and richer because they were smarter or because they saved more or because they were managers or for any of those other reasons. He was right that the structure of capitalism exploits workers. And he was right about the whole historical story that I talked about last time, that leads to the point at which the workers have nothing left but their capacity for labor and are forced to go into the factories and work on the terms laid down by the factory owners. He was right about all of that. He just had the wrong mathematical model. He wasn't wrong in his intuition that capitalism is exploitative, and he wasn't wrong about his intuition that capitalism is mystified, that capitalism represents itself as rational and as an encounter between equals in the marketplace, whereas in fact it is thoroughly mystified and is an exploitative encounter in the factory. He was right about all of that. So I said to myself, there's got to be a way to capture this. There's got to be a different mathematical way to capture what Marx saw was going on in capitalism, different from the standard traditional labor theory of value. Because I had demonstrated, I thought, quite convincingly, and I still believe quite convincingly, that the labor theory of value is not the correct modeling for the exploitative character of capitalism, because it doesn't distinguish labor from any of the other inputs. All of the propositions that I could prove, that anybody could prove, that these mathematicians could prove about labor, could be proved about corn and iron and so forth. What's more, although I found the mathematics very difficult, of course, it was not mystified. It was perfectly transparent in the way that mathematics always is. Once you got a handle on the mathematics, you could look right through it. You could see the structure of it. There was nothing ironic about it. There was nothing mystified about it. There was nothing that required the kind of language that Marx deploys in the first 5 or 6 chapters of Capital. It was as clear and as transparent as the writings of Ricardo was, except that it was mathematically more sophisticated and therefore more powerful. So this modeling of capitalism, according to the labor theory of value, had, oddly enough, not only failed to capture the structure of capitalism, it had failed to capture the mystery of capitalism, the ideological rationalizations of capitalism. It had failed. You could tell a story about those, as Marx does. You could say striking and exciting things about those, but when you got past all of that prelude and got down to it and did your economics, what Marx was doing, it seemed to me, was just as transparent as what Ricardo was doing, and therefore was failing to capture what Marx himself had understood was the distinctive feature of a capitalist economic system, namely its mystification and its exploitation. So I said to myself, how can we do this? How can I reconstruct the equations so that they capture Marx's insight about the exploitative character of capitalism and builds into the equations the mystifications that he so brilliantly described in those early chapters as obscuring the reality of capitalism, making it seem as though capitalism takes place in the sunlit marketplace, whereas in fact it takes place in the dark, satanic mills of the factories. Well, I said, what is the central mystification? It is, as I said earlier, that the workers are treated as though they were petty commodity producers, petty capitalists, small capitalists. Capitalism treats the workers as though they produce a commodity just like anybody else. What is the commodity they produce? Abstract, socially necessary labor. And they come into the marketplace and they sell it. What they essentially do is strike a deal with people who are selling other things. They make a bargain. For a certain amount of money, they will sell their goods. That's the same thing that a wool producer does, that a corn producer does, that an iron producer does. The corn producer brings bushels of wheat into corn, by the way, I think I told you. Corn is just the English word for the dominant crop in the region. And since wheat was the dominant crop, they called wheat corn. I told you this, right? Oh, then when the English explorers got to the New World, they found that the local grain was an odd-looking thing on a tube with little kernels on it called maize. And since that was the dominant grain, they called it corn. That's why we call corn corn. But the corn laws in England didn't have anything to do with kernels of corn or with maize. They had to do with wheat importation. Okay, just a little clarification. It took me a long time to figure that out, by the way. I read all these books about classical political economy, and I kept saying, there isn't any corn in England. Why do they talk about corn all the time? I've eaten corn on the cob. I like corn on the cob. My wife likes popcorn, but it doesn't grow in England. Why are they talking about it? And then I discovered that they were really talking about the dominant grain of the region, which they call corn. Okay, just a little clarification for the next time you're thinking about making popcorn. This is the central mystification, that the workers are treated as petty commodity producers. Therefore, they have to be modeled that way in the mathematics. They have to be modeled in the mathematics as commodity producers. Now, according to Smith and Ricardo, and Marx accepted their view on this, the way in which the capitalist market works is this. This is a very elementary and simple model which they all employed. The assumption is that all of the capitalists have what economists now call perfect information. There's a whole industry of capitalists who are dealing with the mathematics of imperfect information. But these theorists, Ricardo especially, were assuming that there was perfect information. And that meant that if there was a corn producer, somebody growing wheat, who discovered that he was not making as big a profit on his investment as the guy who was running the iron foundry, he'd get out of wheat and into iron, because he didn't have a romantic attachment to growing wheat. He just wanted to make the biggest possible rate of return on his investment. They were not sentimentalists. When I was young, which is when your grandparents were young, there was a guy in America named Louie Wolfson who got very rich going into the garbage industry after World War II. He made a fortune collecting up garbage. He didn't get invited to all the best parties. His sons and daughters didn't go to the cotillions. He was not considered a refined gentleman, but he made a fortune in garbage. He didn't care. Garbage, diamonds, it was all the same to him. If you could make a good profit, you go into it. So he ran a line of garbage trucks and a line of garbage scows when nobody else was, and he made a fortune in garbage. That's the quintessential capitalist mentality. Whatever is paying the highest rate of return, that's what I'll go into. Now, what's the effect of this? This is something Adam Smith understood 200 years ago and more. 200, good Lord, this is 2018, almost 250 years ago. Adam Smith realized if you've got people producing corn and you've got people producing iron, and the corn producers aren't making as much as the iron producers, what will happen? Well, a couple of corn producers will decide to go into iron production. When the corn producers go into iron production, they stop producing corn. Therefore, there's less corn in the marketplace. If there's less corn in the marketplace, buyers bid up the price because there's a shortage, and so the price goes up. But the cost of producing the corn hasn't gone up, so the corn producers are making a higher profit. Meanwhile, the corn producers who went into iron are producing iron, and that means there's more iron being produced. If there's more iron being produced, there's an excess of iron that drives the price down in the market. So the profit rate for iron goes down. And so they equilibrate. All of the different commodities all the different producers are moving their capital around, trying to make the greatest possible return on their investment. And they, like Louie Wolfson, they don't care what they're producing. All they care about is the rate of return. And so in the passage which in the phrase which I've now quoted, this is my third time because I love it so much, as Adam Smith says, by the higgling and jiggling of the marketplace, what happens is that a uniform rate of return is established in the entire economy. And that's why when we put up our price equations, there's one profit rate, pi, for everybody. There may not at a given moment be an exactly equal profit rate in every industry, but there's a tendency for capitalists to move their capital around. Now remember, an important fact which I'll come back to in a few moments. If you have an iron foundry and you decide you want to go into wheat production, you can't just walk in one day and say, okay, close it down, I'm putting my capital into wheat production. You're stuck with this foundry, and unless somebody wants to buy it from you, you can't get your capital out and put it into wheat production. It takes a while for you to transfer your capital. You got to run down your stocks, you got to let the old machinery wear out and take the depreciation fund and shift it over to wheat production and so forth. So it's not an instantaneous process, but over time, there's an equilibration of the profit rate, which results from the fact that everybody is seeking the best possible rate of return on his invested capital. Okay? That's the way capitalism works. Fine. What about the workers? The workers are petty commodity producers. What is their capital? Well, their capital is the money they spend to produce their commodity. That is the money they spend for their food, clothing, and shelter. If they want to switch their capital over into another line, now they're not stupid, these workers. They know that they're not making the going rate of return on invested capital. They know they're getting screwed. And so they say to themselves, we got to get out of this labor producing business. This is not a good business to be in. It may be a high-toned business, but it's not paying the going rate of return. We got to get into something that's paying the going rate of return, like maybe iron production. So they try to shift their capital over. The trouble is their capital is the money they spend for their food. So if they stop eating and live on air, they can accumulate, while they work, they can accumulate some capital and shift it over. The trouble is, when the iron producer wants to move into wheat production, he cashes in his investment in iron and starts investing in wheat. But when the workers want to get out of labor production and into something that's paying better, like wheat production, if they try to cash in their capital, the only way they can do it is by cashing it in, dying. They can't live on air, they're going to die, they're stuck. So even what I need to do, I thought to myself, is to construct a model of a capitalist system in which one line of production is unable to earn the going rate of return. It will have a different rate of return. Now, if there is a tremendous glut of producers producing that in that line of production, the rate of return is going to be zero. They won't make anything over and above what it takes just to reproduce their ability to produce their commodities. But if there's a shortage of people producing that commodity, then maybe they will earn something above zero in their rate of return. I want to set up a system of equations, I told myself, in which there is a system-wide rate of return, pi, except in one line of production. And in that line of production, it's going to be different. So since I only know a couple of Greek letters, I said, let's call that rate of return omega. Why not? I mean, I don't even know what omega stands for, but it's not pi, so it'll work. So I set up some equations. Here are the revised price equations for system C. Same line for corn, earns pi, the rate of return. Same line for iron, earns pi, the rate of return. But in the labor sector, the labor producers earn a different rate of return, omega. And omega may be 0. It may be 0 because they can't move their capital out of labor production into corn or iron production. They're stuck. They are simultaneously capitalists, petty commodity producers, and not capitalists because they can't shift their capital around. And that captures the inner contradiction of capitalism. Capitalism represents itself in a way that is internally contradictory. It does not represent the reality of what is going on. It presents a mystified picture of what's going on. And these equations are designed to capture that. Well, once I had done that, once I had set those equations up, then by now I was feeling pretty confident about my ability to manipulate linear algebra. So I set the equations up not for 3 lines of production, but for n lines of production. And any number, no matter how large, so long as it's finite. That is to say, I tried to imagine an entire economy with n inputs. And in n-1 sectors are earning pi on their invested capital, and the nth sector is earning something different, namely omega. And then I asked, what happens if omega is 0? Well, it's not hard to prove that if omega is, and it's intuitively obvious, if omega is 0, that will drive up the prices in all of the other sectors. And those prices will rise. And if omega is 0, it turns out that the difference between the price at which goods sell and their labor value, if you want to talk labor values, is exactly equal to the profit that they make. In other words, all the other sectors are making a profit off the sector that cannot shift its capital around and is condemned to earning nothing but enough just to reproduce itself. And that is exactly what Marx was saying about capitalism. He was saying that what happens in a capitalist market is that the workers, because they have been historically separated from their means of production, from their fields, from their looms, from their spindles, from their shovels, from their pickaxes, and even have been separated from their skills, which get built into the machines. The workers have nothing left to sell but their sheer labor. And because there are so many of them, because there are what Marx called a reserve army of the unemployed, they cannot sell their labor for anything more than bare subsistence. And that's where profit comes from. Remember, most of the people in the society are laborers. They may be only one line in the model, but they're most of the people. And if most of the people are making nothing but bare subsistence, everything else in the economy, over and above what's needed to reproduce the means of production, is going to the capitalists as profit. And that's where profit comes from. So this simple model is designed both to capture the reality of capitalism and to model it in a deliberately misleading and mystified fashion by treating it as a mere accident that the workers are incapable of earning anything but bare subsistence. Now, once I had gotten this far, the following thoughts occurred to me, and to be quite honest, I didn't have the mathematical ability to develop them in the way that I would like. But without using this model, a number of other economists had already done so. The first thing that I couldn't model successfully was what happens if, in certain circumstances, some workers actually are able to demand more than bare subsistence. They may then use what they get not only to live a more comfortable life, but to reinvest in themselves to make their labor more valuable, i.e. they can get education, they can get skills, they can get what Gary Becker, a Nobel Prize-winning neoclassical economist, called human capital. In short, with enough skill, one could take this model and go on to model the kind of hierarchy of wages and hierarchy of skills that we see in the world around us. What is more, none of this takes account of the possibility of labor unions, collections of workers who deliberately drive up the price of their product, their labor, above its subsistence. And none of this takes account of what I talked about early on, the way in which historically a struggle takes place over the definition of what constitutes subsistence, so that what we consider subsistence today is different from what was considered subsistence 100 years ago or 200 years ago. All of that would be required to take this simple model and develop it into a full-scale analysis and critique of capitalism. But the central idea remains the same, namely that capitalism rests on the exploitation of the working class, and that capitalism represents itself, misrepresents itself in a mystified fashion as a system of equals meeting equals in a marketplace where they make free and unconstrained bargains with one another, rather than as a system in the factory where the owners of the factory extract labor from the workers and pay them as little as possible, lowering their subsistence to the point of bare survival. At this point, I decided to publish. So in 1981, I wrote an article called A Critique and Reinterpretation of Marx's Labor Theory of Value. And into it, I put all of these ideas and the equations, the linear algebra equations, and the proofs that I had developed. And then I made a fundamental mistake. I published in a philosophy journal. Philosophy and Public Affairs, leading political philosophy journal of its time. Well, economists didn't read philosophy journals, and philosophers couldn't read economics. So, in the immortal words of David Hume, the article fell stillborn from the presses. Only one mathematical economist read the article, a brilliant Marxist named John Romer, a really first-class economist. And John, whom I met and liked very much, wrote a comment on my article. Now, I was very proud of myself, see, because I had proved that all the propositions that you could articulate about labor value could be articulated and proved about corn values and iron values. That was the basis of the whole development that I undertook. And I was the first person in the world who'd ever thought of that, so far as I could make out. I couldn't find anybody who'd ever had that idea, and certainly nobody had ever proved that. And since it was the only thing I'd ever proved in my entire life, I was very proud of it. And then John said, yeah, Wolff is right, but there's a Spanish economist who published a book 2 years ago in which he said the same thing. Crap. Joseph Vegada, Economía Política y Modelos Multisectoriales. on everybody's reading list, right? Now, I don't read any Spanish, but the nice thing about mathematical economics is it could be written in Chinese and you can still read the equations. So it didn't take me very long to find the passage. And if anybody's interested, you can look this book up. It's on pages 57 and 58. I could have collected up the 32 copies that sold and torn the pages out, but that didn't seem to me like the right thing to do. So I'm the second person in the world to prove this, which is pretty good when considering how many people there are in the world, but not as good as being the first person in the world to prove this. And it's nice that somebody else proved it because it means I'm right. But still, well, there you go. My advice to philosophers is twofold. First, don't try to prove things. And second, if you're going to publish mathematics, don't publish it in the philosophy journal. But this, it seems to me, is an important insight into what Marx was talking about. It is the core of what Marx was talking about. Because Marx understood the historical process by which the workers were expropriated, by which the workers were deprived of ownership of the means of production and therefore forced to sell their labor. He understood that that was the source of profit in a capitalist economy, that was what made capitalism work. Not, as modern economists like to say, that capital and labor are partners working together, each one earning its marginal product, as they like to say, but rather that it is capitalists exploiting workers. That proposition, I am convinced, is as true today as it was in Marx's day and as it was in Adam Smith's day. And with the right mathematical modeling, we can see how that works. Now, that's the end of my story. It is a reinterpretation of Marx, which shows how the mathematics, the mystification, the historical account, the economics, all fit together in a single, integrated, and combined description and analysis of capitalism. And it fulfills, I hope, my promise to show you how the irony can be introduced into the equations. And with that, I leave you to go out and change the world.